I'm going to tell you two stories today, old stories, and they come from the 1001 Arabian Nights. Now these stories have come from all over the world, and they were filtered in through the Arabian countries and given a wonderful frame story, that of Shahrazad, one of the greatest storytellers of all time. In the land there was a king whose wife, whose beloved wife, had betrayed him, and he became convinced in his grief and madness that all women were evil and untrustworthy. But he was not ready to give up the company of young women, and being the king, he decreed that he would marry a different maiden every morning, have a wedding night with her, and have her head cut off the next morning. He went night after night, day after day, through the daughters of princes and merchants and viziers. His country was almost up in arms against him. Now he had a loyal vizier whose job it was to procure these girls, to greet them at the door after their wedding night, and to oversee the cutting off of their heads. And this vizier had two daughters. The oldest one was Shahrazad, and the younger one was Dunizad. Now one day Shahrazad came to her father and said, "Father, grant me this wish that I ask you." And he said, "Oh, anything, my daughter." And she said, "I will be the next bride of the Sultan." "No, you know what happens to those young women." "Father, I must." And she argued, and finally she convinced him. So the next day the vizier brought his own beloved daughter to marry the king. She made just one request. She said, "I have a younger sister who I would like to be able to say goodbye to, and who is used to hearing a story every night. May she come late in the evening, just before dawn, and I will tell her a story." And the king agreed. So that night after the lovemaking, Shahrazad began a story. She said, "O auspicious king, have you heard the story of the fisherman and the Djinn? There was once a poor fisherman who could barely put food on the table for his family. He went out every day and cast his net 4 times to bring in what little he could get from the sea. And he went out to the sea that day, and he spread his net, and he checked the weights, and he cast it, and there was something heavy in it, and he pulled, but it was the carcass of a dead donkey. And he said, "There is no God but God," and he pulled the net up, and he mended it, and he dried it, and he cast it again. And again, when he pulled, it was heavy. It was so heavy, but it was a load of broken pots filled with water. He said, "I will cast it 2 more times." He said, "Lord, you know my need." And he mended the net again, and he dried it, and he cast it, and he pulled, and again it was heavy. It was mud and rocks. The fisherman was discouraged, but he trusted that things would be fine and that he would be provided for. And he mended the net, and he dried it, and he threw it out the 4th and last time. And he pulled it in, and it was the heaviest of all. He pulled, and he had to strip down and get into the water to pull, and there was a great brass jar. "Well," he said, "it will at least bring a little money in the brass market." And he took the jar, and it was so heavy he could not pick it up, but he rolled it higher up on the shore. And he looked at the curious seal. It was sealed with lead and then stamped as with a seal ring. And the fisherman began to pry it off, for he assumed the jar would be full of water and it would be lighter to carry if he drained it out. And he pried off the seal, and he tipped the jar, but nothing came out. And he thought this very curious, and then suddenly an ooze of black smoke began to come out. And the cloud grew, and it filled the sky, and it darkened the sun, and it took the shape of a horrible Djinn, whose head was bigger than the fisherman's whole house, whose ears were like the wings of a bat, whose talons each were long enough to spear a man. And he looked down at the Djinn, and he said, "Oh, mighty Solomon, forgive me, I will never disobey you again." And the fisherman looked up at the Djinn, and he said, "Solomon has been dead for centuries. We are in a new age." "Solomon is gone," said the Djinn, and he stretched his muscles. He said, "Well, I will give you one wish." And, oh, this was just what the fisherman was hoping for he had heard those stories about the magic wishes, and he was getting ready and thinking hard of his wishes. "I will let you wish," said the Djinn, "in what manner you would like to die." "What?" said the fisherman. But I have rescued you from that jar." and that is why I am letting you choose the manner of your death rather than something that I would concoct for you." "That is not fair," said the fisherman. "Let me tell you my story," said the Djinn. "I was one of the rebellious genii, and I fought against Solomon, who wore the ring with the name of God on it, until his loyal jinns subdued me. They brought me before him and asked me to yield, and I refused. And then they sealed me in this jar and sealed with the ring with the name of God, and they threw me far out in the ocean. So I ranted and raged in this jar, and for the first 100 years I said, 'Whoever releases me from this jar, I will make him king among men.' But no one came. And for the second 200 years I said, 'Whoever releases me from this jar, I will give to him all the treasures of the earth.' But no one came. And for the next 200 years I said that whoever released me from the jar, I would give him a wish every day for the rest of his life. But no one came. And I fought against the sides of the jar, and I vowed that whoever released me from the jar, I would let him choose the manner of his death. So choose and be quick, I have things to catch up on." Oh, the fisherman thought about his children. He thought about his poor wife. What would they do without him? And then he said, "No, he is a son of Satan. I am a human being. Surely I can outwit him." And then he looked at the Djinn, this enormous creature, and he said, "Answer me one question truthfully." "Yes," said the Djinn, "answer me in the name of Solomon." And the Djinn gave a little shudder. "All right, I will answer. What is it?" "Were you really in that jar? It does not seem big enough." "I was in the jar." I do not believe you," said the fisherman. "I was in the jar," said the Djinn. "Must I show you?" And the fisherman said, "Yes." And the Djinn again swirled into a cloud of smoke and disappeared into the jar, and as soon as he was in, the fisherman clamped the seal on and pushed the lead down all around. And inside the jar, the Djinn said, "Do you believe me now?" "Yes," said the fisherman, "I believe you, and I have you now. You were in that jar for 800 years. You will be in that jar now till doomsday. I will build a hut right here, and I will warn all the other fishermen not to fish, and tell them that there is a lying, deceitful Djinn in a jar just off the shore." "Oh, do not do that," said the Djinn. "Why not?" said the fisherman. "Oh," said the Djinn, "be merciful." "Were you going to be merciful to me? Did I not beg you to allow me to live?" "Let me out, fisherman, and I will give you the riches of the world." And the Djinn and the fisherman argued back and forth, and they told one another stories in the manner of the Arabian Nights, where every story is nested inside 5 others. And eventually, the fisherman did let the Djinn out of the jar. And by the end of the story, the fisherman was a wealthy man with enough money to support his wife and children and their children's children until the end of their days. And now we come to the 171st night. Shahrazad had been spinning stories for the king with her younger sister listening, night after night after night, and being spared execution night after night after night. And she said, "Oh, auspicious king, I have heard a story of a vizier who had no sons, of a king, not a vizier, a king who had no sons. And this was a great tragedy in the realm, for who would inherit after him? He had prayed and sought and wished, and finally he went to his vizier and he said, 'I need a son.' And the vizier said, 'Go and say your prayers with special fervency and lie with your wife, and I am sure a son will be born.' And sure enough, in 9 months, his wife gave birth to a baby, the likes of which no one had ever seen, as beautiful as the day. And as the child grew in strength and beauty, everyone who saw him said, 'Oh, thank you, God, for creating such a being.' And the boy, whose name was Qamar al-Zarman, loved his father and adored him and would do anything his father asked for. And finally, when the boy was in his middle teen years, the father began to worry that he, who was an old man, might die before his son could take the throne. And he said, 'I want him to marry and take the throne in my lifetime.' And the vizier thought this was a fine idea. So he called the boy to him, and the boy kissed his hands, and he says, 'Oh, my son, I have something to ask you.' 'Oh, Anything, father, said Qamar. I wish you to marry in my lifetime so that you may take the throne. No, father, that is something I can never do. I have read what the poets say about women. I know they are all deceitful and evil, and he who puts his mind on women cannot think of anything else. I have read the poets, father, who say that a woman will open her heart to you today and her thighs to the rest of the world tomorrow. Oh, said the king, and where had his son heard such terrible poetry? And the boy said, no, I absolutely refuse to marry. And the vizier and the king put their heads together, and the vizier said, you know, sire, he is still young. Wait a year and ask him again. So in a year's time, when Qamar had continued to grow in strength and beauty, with a mouth like a bow and hair like a raven's wing and a thin waist and beautiful eyes, and everyone who saw him went, oh, his father again called him to him. And he bowed before his father, and he kissed his hands, and his father stroked his head and said, my son, I would like you to marry in my lifetime so that I can see you set on the throne. No, father, I am sorry. The answer is still no. I will never marry. I have no interest in women, and I will never marry one of them. And the king was very upset. And he again consulted with his vizier, and the vizier said, wait one more year. And next time, ask him in front of a great assembly of your princes and your merchants and your viziers. He will not be able to refuse your request in front of such an assembly. But as it turned out, Qamar was quite able to refuse his request. He walked in before his father. There were the princes and the merchants and the viziers, and his father said, my son, I wish you to marry. And Qamar, who had been standing respectfully, dropped his hands and said, father, I have answered that question 2 times. Have you slipped into your dotage? And he looked at his father's face, and he realized he had crossed a line. And his father said, how dare you speak to me like that, you nursling of sin? And he had soldiers come in and bind Qamar's hands behind him. And he said, take him to the ruined tower and let him think about his sins there. And they led the young man away, hands tied behind his back, to an old stone tower that was never used. And they locked him in, and a strong eunuch was stood before the door to guard it. Qamar threw himself down on a pallet and cried himself to sleep at his rudeness towards his father, at the terrible fate that he had come upon in his life. But eventually he went to sleep. Now in that well, in that tower, there was an old Roman well that no one used. And in that well there lived a Djinnana, a female Djinn. She saw lights in the tower and thought she would come up to see what was going on. And when she saw this beautiful young man with his rosy cheeks and his trim waist and his long legs and his beautiful dark hair and the eyelashes, she fell in love. Oh, and she gazed at him and she looked at him, and then she had to tell someone. So she flew up into the heavens, and as she was flying up, she collided hard with another Djinn of a much lesser stature who bowed down before her. Her name was Mumana. And he, oh, my lady, I am so sorry. I was just so excited. I have seen the most beautiful human in the world, and I had to come up and tell someone. The most beautiful human in the world, said the female Djinn. I have seen the most beautiful human in the world. Oh, he said, he cannot be like mine. Mine is the daughter of the king of China. She is so lovely. Her father has built her 7 palaces to hold her dower, but she will not marry. She says she is already a queen. Why would she let some man rule over her? And when her father pursued the matter, she is so fiery-blooded. She put a sword on the floor, and she said, Father, I put this hilt against my breast, and if you bring up this subject one more time, I will throw myself upon it. So she is shut up in a tall stone tower. Said Mumana, my beloved is also shut up in a stone tower, and he is surely more beautiful than yours. And they argued back and forth, and in truth the only way to decide this matter was to see the 2 young people side by side. She sent the other Djinn off to bring back the princess, whose name was Budar, and he brought her back still asleep into the tower where Prince Qamar was, and they lay them side by side. and in truth they could have been twins, save that one was male and one was female. The lips, the eyes, the tiny shell-like ears, the lovely feet. They went on and on, naming each one of their beautiful characteristics down to the sweetness of their saliva. It became clear they could not decide which of their beloveds was the more beautiful. Mumana said, "We need an impartial judge," and she stamped her foot and called up an Afrit, a truly hideous Djinn, with hair that dangled